In the early hours of August 9th, 1942, it took the Imperial Japanese Navy barely 32 minutes to inflict the worst open-sea defeat in the history of the United States Navy. 4 Allied heavy cruisers, some of the most powerful warships in the Pacific Fleet, were sunk or left burning past saving. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died, most of them in the water, in the dark, without ever seeing the ships that killed them. This is the Battle of Savo Island, and it happened because 7 Japanese cruisers got within torpedo range of an entire Allied fleet, and almost nobody saw them coming until it was already over. To understand how this happened, you have to go back 2 days to August 7th, 1942, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. U.S. Marines had landed on Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, seizing an airfield the Japanese had been building and starting a 6-month campaign that would become one of the turning points of the war. But on the night of August 8th, the Marines ashore were still desperately unloading supplies, and the ships protecting them were exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee after 2 straight days of air attacks and general quarters. Their commander, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, needed just 1 more day to get his transports unloaded. He wasn't going to get it. The Allied screening force protecting the invasion fleet was commanded by British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, and it was, on paper, formidable. 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers, representing the combined naval strength of the United States and Australia in the region. In practice, it was scattered and disorganized. Crutchley split his force into 3 separate groups, patrolling different stretches of water around Savo Island, with almost no coordination between them, no shared radar picture, and radio procedures that hadn't been drilled together. A southern group covered the strait south of Savo with the cruisers Chicago and the Australian cruiser Canberra. A northern group, with the American cruisers Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, covered the passage to the north. A third group of light cruisers guarded the transports further east at Tulagi. 2 picket destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, patrolled the outer approach with radar that was, in theory, supposed to give everyone else warning if anything approached. Meanwhile, Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was already moving. Within hours of hearing about the American landings, Mikawa had assembled a strike force at Rabaul, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer, and sailed south down a stretch of water Allied sailors would soon nickname the Slot, heading straight for Guadalcanal. Along the way, 2 Japanese troop transports sailing to reinforce the area were recalled and sent back. One of them, the Meiyo Maru, was sunk that same night by the American submarine S-38, with the loss of over 300 Japanese lives. A battle so close in time and place to what followed that it's often mistaken for part of the same action, though historians generally treat it as a separate incident entirely. Mikawa's force was spotted by an Allied reconnaissance aircraft during the day on August 8th. The sighting report, through a combination of bad luck and worse communication, took hours to reach Crutchley's ships and arrived stripped of any real urgency, described almost as a routine contact rather than a warning that a Japanese cruiser force was bearing down on the invasion fleet. Mikawa's crews, meanwhile, were among the most drilled night-fighting sailors in the world. Japanese doctrine at this stage of the war built entire careers around night gunnery and torpedo tactics, centered on the devastating Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon with far greater range and a far larger warhead than anything in the American arsenal, fired from specially trained lookout teams who could spot targets in near-total darkness that American crews would have missed entirely. The U.S. Navy, 8 months into the war, simply hadn't caught up to any of it yet. Just before 1 a.m. on August 9th, Mikawa's column slipped past the picket destroyer Blue without being detected at all. This wasn't for lack of equipment. Blue and her sister picket ship, Ralph Talbot, both carried radar specifically positioned to catch exactly this kind of approach. But their radar sets, early and unreliable by later wartime standards, were oriented in ways that left gaps in coverage, and neither ship's watch teams had been drilled to interpret ambiguous returns as anything more than sea clutter. Mikawa's column passed within a few thousand yards of Blue and was never seen. Minutes later, Japanese float planes launched earlier from the cruisers began dropping parachute flares directly over the Allied southern group, lighting up Chicago and Canberra like a stage. At 1:38 a.m., Mikawa's ships fired their first torpedoes. Canberra was hit almost immediately, 2 torpedoes below the waterline, and within minutes, 24 shell hits on top of that. Her captain, Frank Getting, was killed on his own bridge. Fires spread through the ship faster than her crew could fight them, and by mid-morning she had to be scuttled, taking dozens of her sailors down with her. Chicago, hit by a single torpedo forward, turned away from the action entirely, a decision that would be second-guessed for decades afterward, because it took one of the Southern Group's 2 heavy cruisers effectively out of the fight at the exact moment it was needed most. The 2 destroyers screening the Southern Group, Bagley and Patterson, fared better by pure chance than judgment. Patterson's lookouts were the first anywhere in the Allied fleet to spot the Japanese ships at all, radioing a warning that came only moments before the shooting started, far too late to change the outcome, but enough to let both destroyers maneuver clear with only minor damage. Chicago's survival that night turned out to be temporary. Sent home for months of repair, she returned to the Solomons only to be torpedoed and sunk 5 months later at the Battle of Savo Island in January 1943. A grim postscript for a ship that many in the Navy already associated with the worst night of Savo Island. Mikawa's force didn't stop. His ship swept around the northern side of Savo Island and ran straight into the northern group, which had received no warning whatsoever that the southern group was already under attack a few miles away. Captain Frederick Reefcole on Vincennes had no idea anything was wrong until Japanese searchlights and shellfire hit his ship almost simultaneously. Aboard Quincy, the confusion was even sharper. For several critical minutes, some of her officers assumed the searchlights and gunfire lighting up the night were American ships firing on each other by mistake. A fatal hesitation that cost precious time before her own guns opened up in response. It didn't matter. Caught between 2 separate Japanese cruiser divisions that had briefly split apart during their approach, the 3 American cruisers were hit from multiple directions almost simultaneously, unable to fully return fire before their own bridges, gun turrets, and engine rooms were wrecked. In the span of roughly 20 minutes, 3 American heavy cruisers, Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, were reduced to burning wrecks. Quincy alone lost 370 men, including her commanding officer, and went down so quickly that many of her crew never made it off the ship at all. Vincennes lost 322. Astoria lost 219 and briefly appeared to have a chance at survival, remaining afloat for hours after the battle ended, before finally capsizing later that morning. Survivors who went into the water that night later described a scene lit almost like daylight by burning oil and flares, with men swimming past the wreckage of ships that an hour earlier had been among the most powerful warships in the Pacific. By roughly 2:16 a.m., it was over. Mikawa had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers and severely damaged a 5th in barely half an hour of actual gunfire, for the loss of just 58 of his own men and no ships at all in the battle itself. The waters around Savo Island had earned a new name by sunrise, Ironbottom Sound. Mikawa's own force didn't escape entirely unpunished. The following day, as his cruisers made their way back toward base at Kavieng, the American submarine S-44 caught the heavy cruiser Kako with 3 torpedo hits, sinking her with the loss of another 68 Japanese sailors. But that loss came a full day and hundreds of miles removed from Savo Island itself and did nothing to change what had already happened in Ironbottom Sound. And then Mikawa made the decision that historians still argue about. He turned his fleet around and withdrew, without ever attacking the one target that actually mattered, the American transport ship still sitting off Guadalcanal, packed with the supplies, ammunition, and equipment the Marines ashore desperately needed to hold the island they'd just taken. Mikawa believed American aircraft carriers were still in the area and worried his ships would be caught and destroyed by air attack at dawn if he lingered. He was wrong about the carriers. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had already withdrawn them the previous evening, low on fuel and unwilling to risk them further after 2 days of exposure so close to Japanese air bases at Rabaul. That decision, made hours before Mikawa's ships even arrived, was itself controversial within the Navy for years afterward. Fletcher's withdrawal was exactly what left Crutchley's cruisers without air cover at the moment they needed it most, and it meant Turner's transports were dangerously exposed even before a single Japanese shell was fired. Mikawa didn't know any of that. He had just won the most one-sided naval battle of the Pacific War, and he sailed away from the one move that could have turned it into a war-changing victory. It's worth sitting with how badly this could have gone. If Mikawa had pressed his advantage and destroyed Turner's transports, the Marines already ashore on Guadalcanal, cut off, undersupplied, and completely dependent on those ships, might not have been able to hold the island at all. Even without that final blow, the battle's aftermath left the Marines in a genuinely precarious spot. With his screening force gutted, and no guarantee Mikawa wouldn't return, Turner made the difficult call to withdraw his remaining transports on the afternoon of August 9th, before unloading was fully complete. That decision left the Marines on Guadalcanal short on ammunition, food, and heavy equipment for weeks afterward, a shortfall that shaped the brutal, improvised early phase of the entire campaign, fought largely on captured Japanese rations and whatever supplies had made it ashore in the first 2 days. The entire Guadalcanal campaign, the first American ground offensive of the Pacific War, could have collapsed within days of starting. Instead, Mikawa withdrew. Enough of Turner's supplies had made it ashore to sustain the beachhead, and the Marines on Guadalcanal held on through 6 brutal months of fighting that ultimately broke the back of Japanese naval air power in the region. None of that made Savo Island any less of a disaster in the moment. When the news reached Washington, it was treated as close to a national scandal, the worst defeat the U.S. Navy had suffered in open water in its history, delivered by a numerically inferior force that had achieved almost total surprise. News of the scale of the loss was actually kept out of American newspapers for weeks, out of concern for both public morale and operational security, meaning most Americans didn't learn the true extent of what had happened at Savo Island until long after the battle itself. A subsequent Navy inquiry, led by Rear Admiral Arthur Hepburn, spread the blame widely, across scattered command structures, across a screening force that had never trained together as a single unit before being thrown into combat, across an over-reliance on radar that, in 1942, simply wasn't yet reliable enough to substitute for trained lookouts and rehearsed procedures. The inquiry also pointed to simple exhaustion. Crutchley's crews had been at general quarters for the better part of 2 straight days by the time Mikawa arrived, and fatigue that severe degrades judgment in ways that are hard to measure until something goes catastrophically wrong. Captain Howard Bode of the Chicago, whose ship had turned away from the fight rather than engaging, took much of the public blame in the years that followed. He took his own life in 1943, reportedly still consumed by what had happened that night. The larger lesson of Savo Island wasn't really about any one captain's decision. It was about a Navy that, 8 months into the Pacific War, was still learning, at brutal cost, that the tactics, training, and command habits that had worked in peacetime exercises were not enough against an enemy that had spent years rehearsing exactly this kind of night action. Radar sets got better, and more importantly, crews got trained to actually trust and interpret them. Screening forces stopped being thrown together from ships that had never operated as a unit. Night fighting doctrine that the U.S. Navy had treated almost as an afterthought before Savo Island became a genuine priority in the months that followed. Every one of those lessons got applied in the naval battles that followed in the waters around Guadalcanal over the next several months. Battles with names like Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, and the two-day naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, fought harder, smarter, and eventually won, in no small part because of exactly what had gone wrong at Savo Island 4 months earlier. Savo Island didn't cost the Allies the Solomon Islands campaign, but it cost more than 1,000 American and Australian sailors their lives in the space of about half an hour, aboard ships that, the day before, their crews had every reason to believe could handle anything the Imperial Japanese Navy sent at them. They found out otherwise in the dark, with almost no warning, off the coast of an island most of them had never heard of a week earlier. Many of the survivors who did make it into the water spent hours swimming through burning oil before rescue ships finally reached them at dawn, some picked up by the very destroyers that had escaped the attack largely undamaged, ferrying the wounded and the exhausted back toward Tulagi as the sun came up over a strait now littered with wreckage. Their names are still listed on the memorial wall at Ironbottom Sound today, in the same waters where their ships still rest. If you want to understand how the U.S. Navy turned this defeat into the tactics that eventually won the Solomons campaign, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.